what made these men tick, and humiliating Galerius so brazenly might have ticked the Caesar off to the point that he would have viewed overthrowing Diocletian as a reasonable response. So, while I have no trouble believing that Diocletian bawled Galerius out in private, in public, I can't imagine he would have done anything to risk imperial unity, especially for something as petty as making a guy walk in front of your horse for a little while. But it was not all bad for the Romans. And despite the fact that he had been bested in the field, Galerius had obviously put up enough of a fight that the Persian king, whatever his intentions had been before, did not immediately follow up his victory with an invasion of Syria. And it's a good thing that he didn't, because just a few months after the defeat of Galerius, word came up from Egypt that yet another revolt had broken out. The origins of this latest unrest will be dealt with more fully a few episodes down the road when I dive into Diocletian's economic reforms. So just know for now that Diocletian's crackdown on tax evasion did not at all go over well with the perpetually tax-evading Egyptians. Leaving Galerius in Syria to oversee the rebuilding of the frontier defenses, Diocletian decided to personally see to the problem of Egypt. In 297, what had begun as a series of local uprisings had coalesced into a province-wide movement that even had its own self-proclaimed Augustus, a man named Lucius Domitius Domitianus, who was attempting to reassert all the special privileges Egypt, and in particular Alexandria, had always enjoyed, and that Diocletian was now trying to take away. Diocletian, though, had a vision for the future of the empire, and special treatment for special people was not at all a part of that vision. Just ask the citizens of Italy, who, at that same time, were having all of their long-held privileges revoked one by one. Pay taxes? You've got to be joking. But like I said, we'll get into all that later. So Diocletian came down to Egypt, and despite stiff resistance from the natives, he thoroughly smacked down the rebellion with an iron hand. The emperor had no intention of allowing Egypt to become the bleeding ulcer that Britain had been for so long, and mercy towards the rebels was in short supply. There is even a charming little story about how, when he finally took Alexandria after a surprisingly difficult 9-month siege, the enraged Diocletian announced that he was going to slaughter everyone in the city until the blood ran up to his horse's knee. Then, as if on cue, the tired horse decided at that very moment to kneel down, knees, of course, now touching the ground. Diocletian took the hint the gods sent him and ordered a stop to the massacre he was intending to unleash on the Alexandrians. This little story is even more charming because in gratitude, the Alexandrians allegedly built a statue in honor of Diocletian's horse once the emperor had moved on. By the end of 297, though, the revolt was nipped in the bud, Domitianus was dead, and the emperor could turn his attention back to the Persian problem, successfully rebuilding the Syrian legions. And when Diocletian arrived, the senior Augustus was pleased to discover that his junior colleague was ready to go back on the offensive. And it was the offensive they would have to go back on, because despite his initially bold moves, King Narses had learned that the Romans were not the pushover he had perhaps led himself to believe they were. He didn't give up his position in Armenia or Mesopotamia, but he also didn't press on any further. When it became obvious that the Persian king was not going to invade and press his luck inside Roman territory, the emperors decided to take the fight to him again. As we've seen over and over again, the Romans never took a defeat as the last word in anything, and it was in fact almost axiomatic that the last word had to be a Roman victory. If the Romans lost, it was only a setback on the road to final victory. It could not possibly mean an end to hostilities, because the only time the Romans allowed an end to hostilities was when the Romans won. They were simply a maddening opponent that way. So in 298 AD, Galerius marched out at the head of an army to track down Narses and bring an end to hostilities. This time, the Caesar played it a bit smarter. rather than heading straight for the Persian army, which was then encamped on the plains of Mesopotamia, he decided to take the road in through the mountains of Armenia and force Narses to fight on ground that Galerius hoped would neutralize the Persian heavy cavalry advantage. Narses took the bait, and this time, when the two armies met, the legions routed the Sassanids, though the battle was not at all decisive. Narses retreated, and Galerius pursued, hoping to catch the Persians before they re-established themselves on better ground. Luckily, the Persian withdrawal was haphazard, and with the help of local guides, Galerius was able to close the distance between the two armies and launch an attack on the utterly surprised Sassanids when they were still in their camp one night. This time, the battle was decisive. Not only was the Sassanid army cut to pieces, but Narses was forced to flee for his life without being able to stop and collect his wives, his harem, or his royal treasury, all of which fell into the hands of the triumphant Galerius. The Sassanid military was now broken, the king was now running for his life, and valuable hostages had now been seized. Now hostilities began. Well, not quite yet. Galerius took a victory lap down through Mesopotamia in order to sack the Persian capital of Ctesiphon, which at this point was practically a rite of passage for Roman generals serving in the east. Unchecked, Galerius probably would have marched all the way to India, but he was stopped by Diocletian, who was able to see the bigger picture. Diocletian had no desire to rule over Persia. He just wanted peace with the Sassanids on the best possible terms, and with the king's wives and harem being treated with the utmost respect by their Roman captors, Diocletian was now in a position to leverage an even better deal than he had worked out with Bahram in 287, and leverage a better deal he did. A summit was arranged between the Roman emperors and Persian ambassadors at Nispus in 299, where Diocletian laid out his terms. After an amusing, but likely fictitious exchange that saw the Persian envoys attempt to lecture the Romans on the importance of being magnanimous in defeat, and Galerius then practically blowing a blood vessel, demanding to know where the Persians got off lecturing the Romans about magnanimity when the stuffed corpse of Valerian was still being held as a Sassanid trophy. After this, the Persian envoys agreed to all Roman terms. Not only was Armenia brought back into the Roman fold, but for the first time, the kingdoms of the Caucasus Mountains were made Roman clients, and cities on the east side of the Tigris were ceded to Roman control. In every way, Diocletian got the better of the Persians in the Peace of Nispus, and the capture of the Persian royal family was understood to balance the scales for the capture of Valerian. All of which was nice, but what was even nicer was that the peace brokered in 299 would last for the next 40 years, and that was a victory for everyone. So it was that at the close of the 3rd century, a century defined by the empire's near collapse, Rome was as strong as ever. 15 years of political stability overseen by one of the best leaders the empire had ever seen. Internal revolt squelched, external threats neutralized, and a socio-economic order redesigned to match with the realities of this new age. Rome would never again be allowed the kind of freedom of movement it had enjoyed during its various golden ages, and it would indeed be a constant daily struggle just to maintain what Diocletian had established. But something had been established. In the next few weeks, we are going to investigate what exactly had been established, starting next time with an analysis of Rome's new military posture. After that, we'll deal with Diocletian's economic reforms, including his famous edict on prices, and then cover his reorganization of the governmental apparatus. Taken together, Diocletian transformed just about every aspect of Roman life. But again, as I mentioned before, he was not trying to create a new world order. He was trying to save the old world order. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com. Address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Or you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend a new book that I haven't had a chance to read yet since it just came out, but it was a finalist for a National Book Award, so you have to figure it's pretty good. The Poison King, The Life and Legend of Mithridates, Rome's Deadliest Enemy, by Adrian Mayer, a biography of the man who vexed Romans from Sulla to Pompey and just kept popping back up every time they thought he was finished. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 125, The Best Defense is a Good Defense. Over the centuries, the Roman legions had been transformed and then retransformed anytime the old way of getting things done stopped getting things done. The Romans loved their traditions, but they never for a second allowed sentimentality to get in the way of always having the best strategic and tactical military operation in the world. For years, Rome was just another city-state, fielding small armies composed of farmer soldiers who fought using the traditional Greek phalanx. When the phalanx proved unworkable in the hills of Samnium, the Romans adapted the legions into the famous three-line maniple system that they then used to conquer most of the Mediterranean. Then Marius came along and revolutionized not just how the Romans fought, but who was doing the fighting, ushering out the age of the temporary conscript army and ushering in the age of the professional standing army. This, of course, wound up having the unintended side effect of also revolutionizing who these new standing armies fought, because for practically the whole of the next century, the enemy the Roman legions fought more than any other was other Roman legions. Following the triumph of Augustus, the mission of the legions changed again. No longer was their primary objective to conquer foreign lands, but instead it became to protect the lands that had already been conquered. Legionary garrisons were posted on the frontiers to monitor the borders, and that is where they basically stayed for the next 3 centuries. Domitian and Hadrian cemented this mission in the late 1st century and early 2nd century AD by literally building walls to demarcate the empire from the barbarian lands beyond. You'll recall from earlier, though, that these walls were not designed to act as insurmountable fortifications, but rather were erected to control the flow of traffic and serve as a stable line from which the legions could mount forward operations and smother potential threats before they actually reached the empire. The utility of these lines, though, was premised on the notion that the Romans would always have superiority of numbers in the local theaters of operation. As long as the tribes along the Danube or the Rhine or up in Britain were divided from one another, one random chief getting it in his head to cause trouble was no big deal. Send in a legion, smack them around, be home by dinner. But by the late 2nd century, this assumption of numerical superiority became a dangerous fallacy,